Hi, everyone. I am so honored to have been asked to come and speak to you all at the beginning of this think tank session. I feel inspired and encouraged by the work that is going to be done by you all in the next 2 days to better mental health care delivery. My name is Lauren Kennedy West, and I live with schizoaffective disorder. Many of you may already know what that is, but for those who don't, it is a combination of schizophrenia and a major mood disorder. For me, it's bipolar disorder. Schizophrenia is an illness that causes the individual to lose touch with reality. It generally involves symptoms such as hallucinations and delusions, as well as negative symptoms including reduced motivation, emotional flatness, etc. Bipolar disorder is an illness that causes extreme mood swings that include emotional highs, mania or hypomania, and lows, depression. When I was first diagnosed, one of the places I turned to first for more information was, of course, the internet, and YouTube in particular. But I was left feeling rather alone as I didn't find many others sharing their experiences or, patient-centered knowledge and information about what it means to live with the illness. It was for this reason that I decided to create the resource that I had originally been seeking out. My partner Rob and I created the YouTube channel Living Well with Schizophrenia in late 2018 with the intention of helping those living with schizophrenia spectrum illnesses to feel less alone and to build more empathy in the general population about what it really means to live with an illness like schizophrenia. I honestly never really expected much to come of it and was over the moon when our first video sharing my story reached 12 people. But much to my surprise, our channel seemed to really resonate with people as it began to grow quite quickly. We currently have about 170,000 subscribers and over 15 million views on YouTube. We have also created an online peer support platform for people living with and supporting those experiencing schizophrenia spectrum illnesses. It has been incredible to see this peer support model grow and thrive over the last year, and it has become a really valuable resource for people touched by schizophrenia. Before I began sharing my personal story and advocacy work on YouTube, I also worked as a social worker and research in the mental health spheres. I have authored several peer-reviewed articles on bettering the delivery of mental health care and have frontline experience as a social worker. So that's a brief summary of who I am in relation to my experience working in mental health care and advocacy. I know that a large bulk of the work you all are going to be doing in the coming days is around identifying roadblocks in care delivery pathways. And so I want to share with you more about my experiences navigating the mental health care system as a patient, and particularly sharing where I encountered roadblocks and potential areas for change. The World Health Organization has estimated that about 50% of patients in psychiatric hospitals have a diagnosis of schizophrenia. I hope that sharing my experiences as a person living with a schizophrenia spectrum illness will help to shed light on how to better serve these patients, and really all patients in psychiatric care settings. Now, I said that I was going to highlight specific roadblocks within my own story, but I think it's also important to first point out the components of my story that did not get in the way, or rather my various forms of privilege that helped me access care. So I am a young, white female from a middle-class family who was attending university at the onset of my illness. These factors alone position me as a more palatable or deserving mental health patient. This absolutely should not be the case, but I am very aware that if I were a person of color, male, of a lower socioeconomic background, and with less education, I likely would not have fared as well as I did navigating the mental health care system. I was also incredibly lucky to have access to a care team consisting of a counselor, physician, and a psychiatrist for free through the university that I was attending. After graduating, I realized that this is absolutely not the norm and just how difficult it is to access proper care. Okay, so with those details out of the way, I'd like to now share with you parts of my story. I suppose I should begin with talking briefly about my childhood, as a lot of people ask about my childhood, expecting it to be troubled in some way. It really wasn't for the most part. I lived with my mom, dad, and brother, and I had friends. I was definitely a little quieter than most and got lost in my own head a lot, but I was happy. I loved school and I was very active in extracurriculars such as competitive gymnastics, soccer, and various volunteer work. Then in high school, my state of mind began to shift. I was no longer this happy young person. I was much more withdrawn, lost interest in school, and generally felt adrift. After high school, I wasn't sure what I wanted to do, so kind of limped into post-secondary. I was very bothered by the world, though, and my role or lack thereof in it. I began to feel extreme sadness and despondency. I explained some of these sentiments to my family doctor and was prescribed antidepressants. I took them for a while but gave up on them shortly after as it didn't feel they were having much of an impact. I managed to graduate from my first undergraduate program and in 2013 went back to university again to pursue an after degree in social work. My first semester in the new program, my headspace became so depressed and confused that I realized that I needed additional support. So I sought out counseling through the university. I had really no idea how to engage in therapy though, and the awkwardness and silent disposition I developed in the years since high school kind of bled through into these interactions as well. My counselor decided I needed further support and so connected me with a GP, a general practitioner, and a psychiatrist through the university as well. It's hard to put into words how grateful I am that I had these individuals all trying to help and support me. However, despite this support, my headspace deteriorated to the point where I felt that the only option I had was to take my own life. I made an attempt on my life in January 2014 at the age of 22. It's not the right wording to use to say that I wasn't successful, but regardless, I wasn't successful in taking my own life. I ended up hospitalized for the first time. When I got out of the hospital, I was filled with despair at the realization that not only was I unsuccessful, but being hospitalized hadn't helped at all. The next year was a huge struggle trying to keep up with schoolwork while seeing my care team pretty well daily. I kept sliding further and further into despair. 1 year after my first attempt, I decided that it was my best option to try to end my life again. Obviously, I was unsuccessful, but I came much closer this time. I hadn't said a word about my plans to my counselor, but for some reason, he had a feeling that something was off. He decided to send the police to do a wellness check on me. They found me just in time to rush me to the hospital where I ended up on life support for several days. Waking up in the hospital this time was absolutely crushing. All the same feelings as the last time came rushing back, but also this time I was filled with embarrassment too that I had now been unsuccessful in taking my life twice. It felt like I couldn't escape this cycle. Throughout the next year, I continued to try various types of medication and medical interventions such as electroconvulsive therapy or ECT, with minimal positive effects and plenty of negative side effects. During this time, I also began to experience new symptoms, which I later identified as hallucinations. It started with olfactory hallucinations, where I would smell these really terrible smells that I couldn't identify and I couldn't locate the source of. I ended up convinced that I just reeked. I also began to hear voices. They started out with me hearing my name being spoken aloud. I initially brushed this off and the subsequent chatter that followed, thinking I could just hear conversations around me. However, it began happening even when I was completely alone. These new symptoms confused me and frightened me, so I never let my care team know about them at the time. I could feel myself deteriorating mentally even further, and in March 2016, at 24, I had my first manic episode. I became fixated on the idea that my care team was hiding something from me and secretly trying to harm me. I fought the medical clinic to gain access to my medical files and obsessively pored over them, believing that I was finding secret clues and connections that would lead me closer to figuring out what was going on. My boyfriend at the time was starting to wonder if something more serious was going on, and after finding me sleeping in my car outside of the medical clinic one night, decided to try to get me to go to the hospital with him. He was really great at focusing on validating the feelings that I was experiencing and being empathic about that, rather than focusing on negating the delusional thoughts that I was having. I think this was a big part of what made me trust him in taking me to the hospital. I spent another couple of weeks in the hospital and eventually stabilized somewhat, and this time was slapped with a diagnosis of bipolar disorder with psychotic features. Upon reflection, this made a bit of sense as I definitely experienced deep depression, and I realized that I had also experienced hypomania too. I had these pockets of periods during my early 20s where I would go off on adventures traveling or running in the mountains, pushing myself physically and feeling, I suppose you could call it, a zest for life. I graduated that spring of 2016 and landed my dream job doing cancer care research. I was thrilled about this and feeling like maybe I was beginning to see a light. On paper, it seemed like I was doing really well. I had just graduated from my second degree program, landed a great job in a new city that I wanted to live in. I had a loving long-term boyfriend and some close friendships. However, this seeming period of stability lasted less than 3 months, and that summer my world came crashing down. I did not account in my move how difficult it would be to get connected with a new care team. I was told the only way that I could get connected with a psychiatrist was to go through a family physician. However, I couldn't find any physicians who were taking on new clients. I eventually just decided that it wasn't going to happen. I was struggling mentally so much that I had to resign from my new job and move back home. I was devastated. This move back home also coincided with the ending of my relationship. It was very amicable, but still another blow. When I moved back home, I was finally able to get in with a new family physician. He connected me with a psychiatrist who I could only see 6 times. I decided to be more honest about all of the symptoms that I was experiencing, and that I was experiencing what I now know were psychotic symptoms on a regular basis. He diagnosed me with schizoaffective disorder. On some level, this diagnosis felt good to receive, as it felt like a relief that what I was experiencing could finally be attributed to something. However, I was also left feeling lost and scared, as there really are not a lot of success stories being shared about people living with schizophrenia spectrum illnesses. Almost everything we hear in the news or in popular media are very negative and stigmatized depictions of schizophrenia. The sense of loss was compounded with the fact that I was still getting worse. My psychotic symptoms continued to worsen that fall, and I ended up in the hospital for just over a month this time. This hospitalization was a truly horrific experience. First of all, I was brought to the hospital in handcuffs from my psychiatrist's office. I became terrified being locked in a sterile white concrete brick room and began to lose my cool. I was subsequently accosted by hospital staff and tied down by my hands, feet, and chest to a metal gurney while they injected me with antipsychotic medication and something to sedate me. This hospital stay really only got worse, and one time while admitted in the psychiatric institution, I was dragged into an isolation room and pinned down by 6 men, both nursing staff and security, stripped naked and injected with medications again. They left me naked in the room that alarmingly had a window in the door where other patients and staff could walk by and see me naked. I yelled and pounded on the door for them to give me back my clothes. They eventually gave me a blanket, but realizing that I was now that crazy psych ward patient lashing out was a lot to take in. This hospital stay left me traumatized and with a rather deep distrust of the medical system. I was finally being treated, though, for the right thing and began to see some slight improvements. The next couple of years saw me float in and out of jobs due to my mental health. But more importantly, I was slowly rebuilding my life in the sense of trying to strengthen relationships, and most especially my relationship with myself. I put in a lot of work trying to build up self-acceptance and self-compassion and love. I met my now husband in 2018, and long story short, we fell in love, moved in together, and got engaged. He also had 2 kids who I also fell in love with and became mom to. It felt like things were going really quite amazingly. With things feeling like they were going so well, I began to question whether or not I really needed medication. So I began to be less structured in taking them. This led me to follow more delusional thoughts about the medications being poisonous, which led me to completely stop taking them. I don't think it's hard to imagine that this did not end well. I became extremely delusional and very paranoid. My delusional thoughts had spiraled into full-on psychosis, and my husband Rob, not knowing how to manage things, called the police to take me to the hospital. The cops who responded and ended up taking me to the hospital were stark differences. One of them took a very authoritative, aggressive approach with me, and even went so far as getting physical, shoving me into a chair at one point. He was very threatening and made the whole encounter a very hostile one. I was already terrified, and I'm sure you can imagine how this made me feel even worse. In contrast, his partner tried to take a much softer approach and tried to actually talk with me and empathize with how I was feeling. She actually shared that she knew who I was because I had gone to speak to her recruits class about my experiences navigating the mental health care system as someone living with schizoaffective disorder. Despite her partner, she helped me understand that I needed to go to the hospital, and I ended up trusting her enough to get in the cop car and go to the hospital with her. I ended up in the hospital for 2 weeks this time. Given my traumatic history with hospitals, it wasn't terribly helpful, but it did help to stabilize me back on medications. I think it was having a family and going through this that pushed me to realize the importance of working as hard as I can on my wellness. I think it's important, though, to clarify that wellness is not exactly a choice with this illness. However, there are factors that can promote wellness that I tried to adhere to. I focused on building in more routine into my life, which was somewhat upended with the dawn of a global pandemic, but I also tried to focus on eating well and exercising regularly, nurturing my relationships, and just trying to take care of myself as best as possible. Rob and I got married in August 2020, and a few days later found out that I was pregnant too. Pregnancy was a difficult experience for me. It definitely impacted my mental health, and I suppose this may have been compounded by being more isolated due to the pandemic as well. I had initially wanted to reduce and ideally go off my psychiatric medications entirely when I found out that I was pregnant, but very quickly realized that this wasn't going to be possible. I discussed with my psychiatrist how to reduce the potential risks to the baby due to the medications that I was on as much as possible, and we found a medication regimen that worked for me and that I felt relatively safe on while carrying a child. I gave birth to my beautiful, sweet baby boy Theodore on April 12, 2021. We have spent the last year getting to know him as a family and all falling rather smitten with him. Navigating life with 2 older kids, an infant, and keeping up with life and work has presented its challenges for my mental health. However, since Theodore was born, I have felt the most stable I think I ever have. I've read that becoming a mother can be a protective factor for those living with schizophrenia, and I am absolutely experiencing that. I have continued to speak with my psychiatrist every month or 2 or as needed by phone throughout the pandemic. I have also seen my therapist, who I see privately, every month through video chat as well. This type of interaction has been an adjustment and leaves some gaps at times, but I'm grateful I've still been connected with supports throughout this pandemic. Going through all of these experiences and also exploring my diagnosis and my experiences of living with schizoaffective disorder through our YouTube channel have really allowed me to understand the importance of self-advocacy when navigating the mental health care system. It all has also been instrumental in working toward a place of more self-acceptance. I feel more at peace now with the fact that I live with schizoaffective disorder, and I feel I have a better grip on it and a better understanding of how to manage it now and how to advocate for proper care. I don't doubt that I will experience setbacks and more difficult periods down the line as a result of my illness, and I definitely am not symptom-free on a day-to-day basis either. I still experience breakthrough symptoms such as hallucinations, delusions, and paranoia. However, I feel a lot more grounded in managing these aspects than I used to, and for the most part, my medication and self-care regimens really help to keep them at bay too. So those were the main points of my journey through the mental health care system to this point. I'm sure you all have identified some roadblocks in care delivery evident in my story, but I do want to go through and highlight some of them as well. I suppose the first roadblock in care delivery was just kind of a general lack of awareness from those around me, namely those I came into contact with in the school system. I was entering the prodromal phase of my illness and a critical period for early intervention to take place, but no one recognized the signs or intervened. As many of you know, early intervention is an increasingly stressed component of care for those experiencing psychotic illnesses, as not only does it increase the individual's prognosis, but it also reduces the long-term burden on the care system. The next block in my care came from the first general practitioner I saw who prescribed me antidepressants but made no effort to follow up. This was another lost opportunity for early intervention. I had a general lack of social supports during this period. Now, this isn't often seen as the role of healthcare, but something that I'm a really strong advocate for is the incorporation of the social determinants of health and mental health in our conceptions of what healthcare is, or maybe what it could be. When I refer to social determinants of health, I am talking about things like income, education, employment, food security, housing, social inclusion, and other of these types of social factors for health. Something else that I found to be a critical factor in impeding the delivery of meaningful care was the strong focus of the mental health care system on crisis intervention. It seemed the only way the system took any sort of action was if you were in immediate danger to yourself or others, and it largely failed to get at the more chronic nature of mental health problems. I think based on what I shared, it's obvious that I experienced large roadblocks in care delivery with my hospital stays. It doesn't really make sense to me that so often psychiatric patients leave the hospital more traumatized than when they entered it. These experiences can be broken down even further, in my own experience, into treatment from the police, being handcuffed and threatened multiple times, the use of restraints and forcible injections by hospital staff, abuse from staff such as being dragged into isolation, stripped naked, and forcibly injected, and then interactions with treating psychiatrists where manipulation was involved, such as blackmailing me to comply with medication and food with the threat of electroconvulsive therapy against my will. Another big hole in my care was the seemingly tunnel-visioned focus on medications as the sole type of intervention. I think the doctors felt this was the only thing they could really control in terms of providing care, and so there was often little regard for other components of my life. This is again where those important social determinants of health and mental health can come into play. I shared that I didn't always speak openly with my care team about the symptoms that I was experiencing. There is a degree of stigma that exists with any mental illness, but particularly illnesses such as schizophrenia. It can be easier to tell your doctor that you're experiencing low mood than, for example, sharing that you are hearing voices or are seeing things. I think stigma and internalized shame that psychiatric patients often feel is another roadblock in need of addressing. At several points in my story, I spoke about the difficulties in accessing care. It really felt like throwing everything at the wall and seeing what stuck in terms of figuring out how to even enter the care system. There were also limitations in terms of how many times I could access some of the services, which again ignores the chronic nature of managing an illness like schizoaffective disorder. There was also just gaping holes post-discharge from hospital. There never seemed to be a discharge plan of any sort and no communication with community supports. During periods where I was deemed stable as well, the care system seemed to forget about me until I found myself in a crisis situation again. I don't think I need to explain to you that this lack of focus on promoting wellness and supporting recovery ultimately results in poorer outcomes for the patient and higher costs and burden on the healthcare system. Along the same vein, anosognosia, when a patient lacks insight into their illness, is something that I experienced and something that the medical system could work to better address. Providing more education to patients would go a long way, but perhaps more importantly is the idea of building trust with patients. I had one psychiatric nurse once who worked really hard to build rapport and to build trust with me. This allowed me to trust her when I was experiencing difficulties with anosognosia and to accept care. I received multiple misdiagnoses along the way as well. I think this likely has to do with the fractured nature of the medical system. I received different diagnoses from practitioners who only saw me for a small snapshot of time in the grand scheme of my overall illness. Perhaps if there was better communication and cohesion between care sectors and services, this may have been remedied sooner. From a broader perspective, I found that the mental health care system seems to often rely on the competency of individuals at various potential access points. Increasing competency across the board is perhaps one step to address this through better training and increased accountability, but also perhaps working to streamline services so that everyone involved has a better grip on what is going on and where to send people to be connected with the care that they need. There also seemed to be a general lack of patient-centered care. So often, it was the goal of my care providers of making me, the patient, symptom-free, often through more and more medications. This kind of failed to take into account what my goals as the patient really were and addressing the things that were actually causing me distress in my life. Like I said, the focus was often on meds eliminating symptoms, but there also needs to be more discussion of balancing side effects and quality of life. Distrust of the medical system is one of my central delusions, and perhaps it shouldn't always even be chalked up to a delusion. I have had valid reasons to distrust the medical system, and this distrust seems to be a common thread among many psychiatric patients. I think there needs to be a much larger focus on earning the trust back of patients. One of the ways I feel this could happen, and which also happens to be another roadblock as it currently is reworking to rebalance the power dynamic between care providers, especially psychiatrists, and patients. There currently exists an often unhelpful power dichotomy which places all the power in the practitioner's hands and makes the patient feel powerless in their own care. This needs to be reworked to empower the patient to take the helm of directing their own care journey. There were so many roadblocks and complicating factors present in my journey through the mental health care system. That said, I still think I am one of the more fortunate ones in terms of the care that I was able to access. I know there are far more who slip through the many, many cracks in the system and don't end up receiving care that they very much need. I am so grateful for each of you in this room today who are making the commitment to identify these cracks and figure out ways to improve our mental health care systems for those who need it. I really hope that the experiences that I've shared with you today will help to build empathy for those you are trying to serve and will perhaps spark new ideas on how to better approach mental health care in new and innovative ways. If anyone has any additional questions or thoughts, you are welcome to reach out to me. Our YouTube channel, Living Well with Schizophrenia, also goes into greater detail on many of the topics I brought forward here today and more. Thank you so much for allowing me to speak with you all today and share my experiences. I wish you all the very best in the next couple of days of this think tank and beyond. I can't wait to hear all about the ideas and innovations born of this. Thank you so much.